biggest takeaway I had from the History of China course is a greater awareness and understanding of the Chinese cultural identity. I really believe that by understanding the politics and the government of a particular society, you can really understand their cultural values and their cultural mindsets. Because ultimately, the government is a reflection on the circumstances and the events that occur in a society. I think that it's increasingly important to understand the Chinese mindset in today's Chinese-dominated economy. And I think that it's a valuable skill, particularly for Westerners that are looking to further their business pursuits and whatnot, because ultimately it's likely that I will be working for a Chinese employer. So, first, I'd like to talk about the Xia dynasty, and even though it's a mythical dynasty and has not proven to exist, I think it's extremely important to understanding the political foundations in China. There were 3 sage kings during the Xia dynasty that are of particular importance. There's Yao, the first one, who was the quintessential leader. He embodied the quintessential qualities of any human being. He was extremely virtuous, and he unified all of China, which the unification of China ends up being China's main goal. It always strives to keep unity, particularly for such a large landmass. This is quite difficult. Yao, it's important that he is really important in that he set up like a merit-based succession. He chose his successor, Shun, based on merit and not based on dynastic succession. But unfortunately, Yu would appoint his son later on, so that trend would not continue. But what did continue was the merit-based focus of government officials. Shun, who came after Yao, he established a really weird authoritarian democracy. There are 2 quotes from the canon of Shun that I think are kind of strange when you compare them together. The first one is, universal submission prevailed throughout the empire. And then the canon of Shun later goes on to describe how Shun aimed to see with the common people's eyes and hear with their ears. And as a Westerner, this doesn't make sense for me. I've been trained to believe that these 2 things are contradictory. How can an authoritative government have the complete support of the people and rule with the people in mind? And I think in other ancient civilizations, like for example Egypt, the power has always been the main focus of government officials. It has not been to rule with the support of the people. And I think that's very interesting, particularly when you look at Mao later on, because Mao has this authoritarian democracy that was established in before 2000 BCE, and there are parallels, but I'll talk about that later. Shun appointed Yu to be his successor, and there's a quote from the canon of Yu that says, "Do not go against what is right to get the praise of the people." That being said, he conquered with using virtue, not militaristic force. For example, that might sound weird, but when you understand the story, it makes more sense. There was a prince of Miao who was a prince of one of the vassal states, and he refused to submit to the power of Yu. But Yu tried to get him to forcibly submit by sending in an army. That didn't work. So Yu spread word of his virtuous leadership, his benevolence, and whatnot, and then the Prince of Miao was like, I actually want to be a part of China because China is a great place. So Miao ended up willingly submitting to the power of Yu, the mighty sage king. I'd like to talk about the foundational political ideologies of Chinese government. You could argue that the three major political ideologies are Confucianism, legalism, and Taoism. And these arose during the Warring States period, or the Eastern Zhou dynasty, as a response to government corruption and the incapacities of the rulers to adequately handle various events. Confucianism, the first one, was arguably the most important, and is arguably the most important political ideology in terms of the Chinese mindset. Confucianism emphasized benevolent rule and leadership based on virtues, simplicity, and respect. So it was like a father and son type relationship between the government and the ordinary people. Confucius said that politics were an extension of ethics. So if a ruler was morally adequate and was intellectually able to rule, then he would be able to ensure unity. Confucius also placed the family as the center of the socio-political hierarchy and emphasized co-humanity and rituals creating communities as opposed to individual rights. So Confucius would have responded to the age of reason, rationalist type thought of the need for individual human rights. He would have said that that's absurd, that we should, that people would place individual human rights over the betterment and the sanctity of a community. Taoism, next, emphasized a passive, laissez-faire type economy and government. They pretty much said that rulers should rule like a shadowy presence, and that the kings or the emperors should act as managers of the people. The government should manage society, but they shouldn't really interfere with it. They should just keep order. Legalism was absolutely different from Confucianism and Taoism. Legalism talks about an absolute monarchy and the need for centralized government, and said that laws and harsh punishments is needed to keep a society functioning. Confucius, on the other hand, said that laws are the symptoms of a morally bankrupt society, and is quite totally different mindset. But these three ideologies have one thing in common, the biggest thing in common, I think, and that is that they all emphasize the importance of an economy based on necessity, not on extravagance and things that weren't necessary. So they emphasized agriculture over market, capitalism, economy, that type of thing. It was an agrarian society. It was not a mercantilist-based society. So those are the three major political ideologies of ancient China, and they've obviously continued, but in different proportions. So I think that those are important in terms of understanding modern Chinese politics. And by modern, I mean within the last 50 to 100 years. First, I think that I should focus on communism and the rise of Mao. Now, there have been similar people to Mao in Chinese history. There have been similar patterns. And I think that by looking at those, it's easier to understand Mao's mindset. There's a history that has existed, and by seeing that pattern, it's easier to see Mao as not a monster, but as a human being that has had this background type of history. He's a figure that is an archetype of sorts. During the Qin interregnum, Wang Mang, he was a Maoist type figure. He renamed offices, and he made public granaries, and he cut court expenses. He asserted state ownership of forests, swamps, and he was essentially a Karl Marx type. He was emphasizing the need for land reform and redistribution of land in order to lessen the gap between the rich and the poor. Unfortunately, those strands of communism, they failed when, due to the Mandate of Heaven was called, because there were environmental disasters. The Yellow River changed course twice, so that communist assertion in Chinese history, that was repressed. During the Ming Dynasty, you also have a figure that was very similar to Mao, in my opinion. Hongwu, the first emperor of the Ming Dynasty, has been called, this has been said about him. Seldom has the course of Chinese history been as influenced by a single personality as much as it was by the founder of the Ming Dynasty. That's about Hongwu. Hongwu was a former peasant, like Mao, and he initiated land reforms. He began demanding the need to lessen the forced labor on the peasant class, and he began to say that they should be taxing the elite versus the peasants, which was also the case with Han Wudi, when he taxed the merchant class as opposed to the peasant class in order to fund the Great Wall, then the protection of the Silk Road. Hongwu, he also assumed Confucian views on authority, but was totally opposed to the Confucius view that if a leader was ineffective, the people were justified in rebelling against him, which is also what Mao assumed. That's the position Mao assumed, and that's why Confucianism up until recently was seen as a taboo type political ideology, because during Mao's time he was not for anything to do with the opposition of the government rule. Hongwu, this is quite interesting, I find. He established a code of laws that protected both slaves and free citizens. Slaves and free citizens, not just free citizens, slaves as well. So he was trying to lessen the rich-poor gap and bring about some level of equality. But he also initiated Stalinist-type purges and increased the emperor's absolutism. So I think that looking at his figure is very important into understanding Mao, because it makes Mao less of a monster, as he is no exception. There is a rule in Chinese history that kind of prevails, and if we think that Mao is unique in his approach, that would be wrong. So, the Republic of China, first of all, which is before the communist rule, while it did wonders to the urban elite, it's largely unaffected, all the reforms largely unaffected the peasant class, and villagers suffered from warlords, and there was an increased level of prostitution. It was extremely immoral, corrupt government. It was awful. The Communist Party began to look really good in light of this corrupted nationalist party. During the Japanese War in particular, so Western Front of World War II, Eastern Front of World War II, the nationalists decided to keep on attacking the communists and do nothing to stop the Japanese that were threatening to invade and were invading. And the communists continued to fight against the far militaristically superior Japanese. So it seems like the Nationalist Party were ignoring the major problems in China. They were choosing to focus on a petty dispute with the Communist Party as opposed to focusing on defending China from this Japanese invasion. So, in Chinese history, there's been a pattern. Whenever there's a morally incorrupt leader, they will rebel somehow. Someone will rebel, take over, and establish something that initially is quite rocky but ends up progressing to some type of peak. So that's what Mao Zedong did. Chiang Kai-Shek, who was a leader of China during the Republic of China phase, he was a leader of the Nationalist Party. He fled to Taiwan, taking all of the country's money, taking it with and he's backed by the U.S. And China, Mao, was left with a poor country with no military, a very weak agricultural base because everything had been trampled due to war, foreign pressure, and very few elites. So quite limited technology because most of them had fled to Taiwan. That's very important in understanding why Mao Zedong did what he did, which pretty much he just aimed to better China as a whole. He aimed to initiate reforms that would create a utopian society, but he overreached, similarly to Qin Shi Huangdi during the Qin dynasty. He started off great, but then he overreached and became blinded by his goals, his righteous goals. So initially, Mao initiated land reforms, so he redistributed lands to peasants. There were social reforms, the work units were created, which ensured healthcare, housing, education, and employment. So it was a social safety net. He also abolished polygamy. He reformed the family. He allowed women to get divorced. Women were now legally equal to men. He reformed the language, making it more simplistic so that the peasants were able to read Chinese, really creating a simple Chinese foundation. So it's like the peasants they were equally capable of reading Chinese. They had the capability to be equally literate. Mass organizations were set up, and he aims to get rid of all corrupt Western influence, like prostitution, opium, theft, that type of thing. So he initiated a stricter enforcement of the law, kind of going a whole legalist type ideology. And he established the People's Democratic Dictatorship, kind of like Xin. It was an absolute democracy. Government took over banks, they initiated reforms, they began to expand heavy industry, and initially it was very, very successful with evidence of the first 5-year plan, but it created an unbalanced economic model because there was a strong focus on taking or taxing agriculture. So people began to shift towards the merchant class. The merchant class was taking over as the ideal class in Chinese society, which has never been done before. The Korean War was important in that there was a scapegoat created. The U.S. was created as a scapegoat. The Korean War was essentially a proxy war between China and America, and it kind of drew China into the Cold War at the time. It really drew China in, but the U.S. recognized China's regime as a fact of life. They no longer continued to deny its existence, which is quite a big achievement for China. It's kind of like the end of the century of humiliation. Mao ultimately, this was his turning point. This is where he failed. The Great Leap Forward was total failure because of environmental disasters. He was misinformed about statistics, and he pressured peasants to produce more than they possibly could produce, creating a famine that killed 30 million people. This blackened his image. People were really mad at Mao. But then Mao, because of this awful thing that happened, he began encouraging people to speak out against the Chinese government. So the 100 Flowers campaign. But then he reversed that and said that he didn't want people to speak out against the Chinese government because that would destroy his utopian image. So there was an anti-rightist movement, and then you have the Cultural Revolution, which Mao feared that China was becoming corrupt and it was becoming a dictatorship that was solely based on the people. So he began to attack pretty much all the elites in the country. On average, under Mao, the standards of living increased, but life was more regimented. Literacy rates actually increased because peasants were able to read and write now. There was an increased distrust between the people and the Chinese government. Chinese culture was standardized, and it was really a shared cultural identity. Before you have different different state areas in Chinese history. You've had different feudal type things, and you've had different minority groups. But Mao succeeded in really establishing one uniform Chinese identity. Following Mao, China's adopted a much more liberal communist system. Even though it's a communist government, it's quite a liberal economy. It's quite capitalist, actually, because Deng, the pragmatist, he believed that the only way to get China to modernize quick enough was to adopt Western ways. And that's where we are now, where China is continuing on its rise towards a peak, but hopefully it will continue rising, and that's what it seems to be doing right now. It seems like China's government has finally come up with like the perfect combination for this day and age between the different ideologies. Okay.